Johnny Klemme has had a lot of conversations. How to save the farm, how to change the farm, how to sell the farm, how to overcome family differences about the farm. That's why this Indiana farmer, advisor, broker, and auctioneer decided that it was time to do something. Like, time to write a book. Hi, I'm Dave Price. Johnny's book, American Family Farmland, is based on his experiences with hundreds of farm families over the years, succession plans, business plans, and sometimes family fights about the future. He wants this to be a reference guide for the future of farmland ownership. We're going to start our conversation with Johnny about what made him put the past few decades of conversation into a book. All right, Mr. Author, how did this book happen?
Great question, Dave. And thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. I've
Of course, we appreciate you being here.
been a subscriber to the content for a while, and I love what you guys are doing in terms of news reporting and what's really happening out there in the landscape. So,
Appreciate that.
um, yeah, I mean, the book ultimately is a culmination of my passion for the family farm and my professional experience. It's an idea that I had all the way back in 2019, and slowly with notes and some help from a publisher, I was able to bring the book to life and just really highlight what's happening with the American family farm right now with generational transfers and the difficult decisions that happen and the difficult conversations that need to happen around the kitchen table.
I've written two books, and especially on the first one, when admittedly I didn't know what the heck I was doing, I had this huge closet full of notes and all these thoughts about, hey, I should write about this. Hey, I should write about this. And then one day you kind of do it. I'm curious how you decided, and obviously we'll get into the book and the things that you want to share. How did you decide what goes in this?
Yeah, great question. And I'm glad you can relate on that level because I still remember the first meeting with my publisher and they said, based on what you're telling us and what we think would be the right type of book for you, we just think you need to write 45,000 words. And
That's
that
not
was
intimidating,
daunting.
right?
Yeah, very intimidating. And when I first truly sat down to really start writing the book, I mean, I had complete writer's block. I couldn't
Hmm.
do it. Ultimately, like anything, you surround yourself with great people. I started, having conversations with other authors, with a couple of different book strategists, and we sort of took, these overarching concepts of the family farm, the legacy of the family farm, the current shift in ownership challenges, and all of the very problems and challenges that all of my clients face on a daily basis. And we just started breaking them down into bite-sized chunks. Then eventually it was like, well, hey, section one, you need to write this many chapters, and it's, your word count goal is 5,000 words for this chapter, and then it started flowing. So.
So what you talked about kind of legacy, and the one thing that's been fascinating to me doing this podcast for the last 2+ years now is I think for some people there's a lot of pressure, right?
Yeah.
Like in a lot of ways, perhaps you and your spouse own the land, and maybe especially if it's been in the family for generations, and you're of that age where you want to retire, or maybe you have to retire, and you're thinking, what's going to happen with that? Then as the kid or the grandkid, do you want to do this?
Right.
Right? And I
Yeah.
mean, that's a lot of pressure, not to mention the pressure of, man, my great 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 grandparents farmed this land, they passed it on, and it is super hard right now, and I'm not sure I can pay the bills. And that can be a whole other pressure you have to deal with. So, can you talk a little bit about maybe relying on both what you wrote about, but then also the people you've experienced over the years, maybe to kind of get into that, just the pressure side of it?
Yeah, absolutely. Because the pressure is real, and a lot of my clients, they're either actively farming or they've inherited part of the farm with non-farming heirs. Sometimes those
Mhm.
heirs are involved, sometimes they're not. And sometimes there's a real in-your-face pressure, and sometimes that's where family dynamics are really challenging. And then other times there's this sort of quiet pressure that nobody talks about, right? And that's maybe that pressure to I need to preserve this legacy that my grandparents or great grandparents had for me. And some people are preserving it for the wrong reasons, and maybe it's not necessarily the right fit anymore. And that's, where a lot of my consulting and mediation work is with a lot of farm families that I work with, because sometimes you need to reimagine what the legacy is, to sort of get out from underneath that pressure. And sometimes it's just difficult conversations that families have to say, hey, maybe this is a different chapter of our family legacy going forward, and maybe we do need to hand the torch off to the next family.
So how do you handle the conversations when you're looking at the potential heirs when not everybody is in agreement about what should happen? Perhaps
Yeah.
not everybody even wants to be involved. Some want to sell, some don't. How do you handle that?
Yeah, great question. Every situation's unique. I mean, there's lessons learned from every experience and every farm family that I've worked with over the years. Uh, It always starts with listening. I mean, first and foremost, I take a pretty empathetic approach, and do the best that I can to listen to everybody's perspective as a starting point. But I think the other thing that you have to recognize up front is, can the family even be in the same room together?
Hmm.
And more often than not, the answer is yes. A lot of times you hear the coffee shop talk stories of the bad stuff that happens, the long lost heir that reappears out of nowhere, whatever it happens to be. But overwhelmingly, the majority of the families that I work with are on speaking terms. It's just a matter of understanding everybody's perspective and sort of sometimes just reframing the context, so it's not as aggressive or doesn't feel like somebody's pointing fingers.
Another matter that I think is especially timely as we talk to you right now, as we start moving toward the end of 2025, we have a lot of family farmers who are really struggling financially, and there's so many things up in the air. As we talk, the parts of the federal government are still shut down, so that's impacted some of the USDA services, and we've also got all this tariff uncertainty. You undoubtedly have to have hard conversations, and I'm sure emotional conversations with families as they try to decide, can I keep doing this? Can I make it through the winter here so that we can even survive next year? Or is it time to sell? How do you have those conversations?
Yeah, sometimes they don't go easy and sometimes they do. I mean, there's plenty of kitchen tables that I sit at where there's a lot of tears,
Mhm.
and that's natural, right? I mean, those are natural emotions that people sometimes just need to experience so then they can get through those to make the right decision for them. Ironically, today though, the USDA offices and NRCS offices reopened today. I drove by earlier today, our local office, and it looked like the parking lot was, it was standing room only
Mhm.
almost over there. But
A lot
yeah, I
to catch
mean,
up on.
yeah, for sure. And yeah, they're not easy conversations. I think that's why if you're in a situation where you're going to pass the farm to the next generation, or maybe you're the person in line who's going to take that big responsibility on, having these conversations sooner rather than later is of utmost importance. Succession planning is not easy. It requires a team. You got to have a great CPA, you got to have a great attorney, you got to have goals, and in today's day and age, the family farm is wide and varied. I mean, it could be a 5 acre vegetable farm, but it could also be a 10 or a $20,000 or 20,000 acre row crop farm. You got to have processes, systems in places, and I think you kind of have to swallow hard sometimes, and you got to have the difficult conversations. If you can't have them, find somebody that can help you have those difficult conversations, or bring in a mediator if you have to. But I think the sooner you start that succession planning, the easier those decisions come or become once they have to happen.
What about the balance of paying the bills and hopefully making your life more comfortably getting by financially with the stewardship of the land?
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of the families I work with, I mean, are torn, right? I mean, they want to preserve the family farm. They don't want to just see it go to the wayside. A lot of times we may come up with something creative, and how can we make it a win-win? Whether that's working with sometimes that's working with a local community foundation and maybe using proceeds from a partial sale to fund a scholarship or fund something in memory of parents or grandparents, that might support agriculture or whatever, the family might value the most. But uh, sometimes the process is smooth and easy, and sometimes the process takes, several years.
I should have asked you this to start us off, but can you describe sort of geographically the area where you most cover, you're most familiar with, and what that's all about?
Yeah, absolutely. Today I'm actually at my home office at our family farm in Warren County, Indiana. We're about 20 minutes southwest of Purdue University. Go Boilers! Um, but I primarily work in the Midwest. I mean, my home territory is pretty much statewide in Indiana, but I work with farm families all over the country that might own farms here in Indiana, Illinois, Michigan. But primarily the I states is where I do most of my work.
In your immediate vicinity, what's growing there, and is that changing at all?
Yeah, so right here where we're at, it's an interesting dynamic where we're at. I mean, we've got, a lot of flat black former prairie soils, my
Hmm.
home county of Benton County and the northwest part of Warren County where we've got, heavy row crop, corn, soybean, wheat rotations. We've got dairies out this way. I mean, there's a lot of alfalfa that gets grown out here. We're actually very near a couple of the largest, regen organic farms in the state of Indiana. So we've got a really interesting mix and dynamic of what's going on here. But I mean, we've got farmers just down the road that have fully regenerative, organic at scale operations where they're doing livestock integration across all those acres. And then we've just got, more traditional, row crop agriculture, popcorn. There's some tomatoes and other vegetables that get grown near where we're at, but we're primarily row crops.
Corn, beans, and wheat, they all may have their own unique challenges, but it seems like they are all dealing with price pressures. What
Yeah.
is your experience with how they're faring?
I mean, I don't think anybody's happy about prices. I think that's pretty easy right
Hmm.
there. But I'd say like anything, there are certain farmers and certain families who run a really tight ship, who are really excellent at business, really excellent at finances, who will continue to weather this type of storm. And like any sort of, unfortunate storm that does occur, you often find that sometimes it's bad luck, and maybe it's weather or whatever it happens to be. But, ultimately, I think these are great reminders of the importance of resiliency planning and, making sure you got your financial ducks in a row.
I'm going to put you on the spot here, but in light of all of these financial pressures, are you having more conversations with folks who are thinking about maybe it's time to transition to something else? And I appreciate that that's a huge deal that you've been doing corn and beans or wheat all your life, and all of a sudden you're thinking, hey, let's try something else. But are those conversations happening more often now, or is it just too complicated and the focus is let's just try to make it with what we're doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's sort of a regional challenge, right? There's areas where people are super fortunate because of proximity to have alternative markets that they can consider,
Hmm.
right? For other people who just geographically, they don't have a lot of other options out there. I was having a conversation with a farmer just this week while I was traveling, and we were talking about some of those very things. And he and his wife, they're in their 30s, and they're, multiple generation on their family farm. And they made the decision 3 years ago to transition one 80-acre farm to organic, right?
Okay.
And admittedly, he said it was not easy and it is still not easy.
Hmm.
but they did diversify, right? And it has helped their bottom line tremendously. Now they're fortunate. They can grow some seed beans. We've got outlets for non-GMO, corn and soybeans with these dairies around here as well. So, um, but yeah, I feel for those who, maybe feel like they're locked in a box with what they can grow and produce. It's not an easy spot to be today.
Okay, let's try to be optimistic here. And I'm looking one chapter in particular was chapter 8.
Okay.
And it's called Strategic Solutions for Keeping the Farm.
Yeah.
And that is probably, at least in my mind, even more prescient right now as we talk about these financial pressures. So if folks are old enough, they can remember the crisis of the 1980s and what that did to the Midwest. For these folks who are looking at these margins, and especially for those folks who are like, man, we're going to go backwards on this, this is going to be another year of loss. What kind of strategies, what kind of conversations are you having with these folks about the finances and how to make this work? Maybe it's cost savings here that they hadn't thought about, or kind of making a different plan going forward. What are those conversations like?
Yeah, and they're varied. They are varied, for farms and farm families that find themselves closer to urban centers or large metro areas, Some of those types of conversations are much easier to
Sure.
have, and they're not quite as challenging because you've got access to consumers, right? And so, diversifying or reimagining your farm, whether it's a wedding venue or it's a
Hmm.
weekend getaway or it's an Airbnb. Some of those things aren't super challenging to do. I mean, I know farm families who've, renovated and converted the old beautiful family barn into, an Airbnb slash wedding venue, and they've diversified. Was it easy? Absolutely not. It's not for everybody, right? For some people, the right solution is growth and taking on more acres. For some families, it's not, but you know, geography plays a big role. I mean, some of the other conversations that we have quite often are, what are the strengths of the next generation that's coming in, and how can we take their strengths, and put it to use in our operation? Ideas don't always have to be, from the top down, so to speak, right? Some of the best ideas are, it's just the person sitting next to you at the table, so to speak. And that's where I focus a lot on listening and communication, because sometimes the best solution for the family farm is sitting right in front of you, but you're so caught up in, the finances and the challenge and just the day to day that sometimes it gets overlooked.
Because of the diversity of the folks you get to work with all these years, I'm sure that you really get to see both the strengths and the weaknesses in some of these smaller communities. Like, I'm talking to you from Iowa, where we have two-thirds of our state, two-thirds of the counties in our state have been shrinking in population over the past decade, and some of them for many decades. And we have these population centers, a handful of them in the state, that's the growth. Most of the other areas are shrinking. So what's left in these smaller communities are consolidated school districts. Once you lose your school in town, that can be a really tough thing to overcome. You start losing some of these downtown restaurants where folks used to come from the farm. Now there are fewer people working on the farm, or maybe they don't have that kind of income. The small town car dealership, that's used to selling the nice pickups at the end of the year after a good year, all those kind of things. What are your experiences when it comes to what we're going to have to do to strengthen the economic vitality in these small areas in light of the fact that we have fewer people in farming?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a rising tide lifts all ships.
Hmm.
I'll speak from my own backyard. I mean, we experienced that in my home county of Benton, and you could see the writing on the wall, even just with like attendance of like community festivals, even
Mhm.
just, 7, 8 years ago. However, there's something that occurs when new energy and new lifeblood and new people come in, to sort of reinvigorate things. And at least in my local area, in our home counties here, we have a lot of younger folks who are very vested. They remember how amazing it was, and there's been a lot of community action that has really happened at a grassroots level where I'm at anyway. It doesn't happen everywhere. I mean, I see it all over, where you can. It just looks like a time capsule of when, the life got sucked out of a small rural town, and it's really unfortunate. But I think it always takes new people coming in, stepping up into leadership roles. I mean, I think this is why, any sort of programs, that get youth involved with the communities are really important. Hard work ethic, all of those values that I guess we learned on the family farm, are just as important, probably more important today, to help keep rural communities thriving.
I had wondered as we were all suffering through all the uncertainties of COVID and this concept of remote work became more prominent. We've seen maybe a reversal in some ways of that, but I had wondered if that could be kind of a minor equalizer for some of these smaller towns where maybe you're living in a big city somewhere and you're like, man, I'm sick of this hour-long commute to work every day. I can go back to where I grew up. And since one of us is going to have to work off farm anyway to kind of make the numbers work, then one of us can work remotely and all that. I don't know that I've seen good data to show if that's actually happening in some of these smaller towns and if it's brought any kind of economic hope.
Yeah, I don't know. I've not seen any data. I don't know if there's been a big study done. I
Yeah.
would be very fascinated though to see what that's like. I know in Greater Lafayette, which is where Purdue University is, I mean one of the stats that they like to tout is, they're one of the top 5 places to work remotely because of cost of living,
Hmm.
etc. But when I put on my other hat with our appraisal, farm management, brokerage side of things, a lot of the buyers that are looking to buy some of these rural properties, those are some of the things that they're talking about. They can work from home now. They're trying to
Hmm.
make their rural life or rural living dream come true. And I don't know. I mean, I've definitely seen it. Is it widespread? I don't know. I think you bring up a really great point, and I hope somebody is doing a study on that.
Okay, so for those folks, what kind of conversations are you having with them that maybe they haven't? I think it's one thing if you grew up in a smaller community, you already know what it's about. But if you're looking at it from afar and you saw it in a movie or something and thought, oh man, this is like a Hallmark special, this is all about me. Well, there are things you have to adjust to too. If you're spoiled on you think Costco is the be all end all and you like being able to drive 15 minutes and getting all your stuff for a month. It doesn't quite work that way when you live 2 hours from one. So, what
That's
kind of
very
conversations do you have with those folks?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all about perspective too. Most of the folks that are in that situation, somebody in the family has a tie to rural life, it seems like, or there was a tie to the family farm. They grew up on the family farm. It no longer exists, and there's something missing inside that I
Hmm.
think they're seeking or searching for, that seems to be pretty common. I mean, post COVID, I mean, obviously there's this huge boom in people wanting to invest in land and from an investment standpoint, diversify portfolios. But a lot of that big push too was just people wanted to ensure they had some space and a safety net and a place to get some fresh air, I think. And I don't know, I hope that trend sort of continues and, maybe working remotely is part of what will continue to help rural communities thrive.
You mentioned investment. How do you have that conversation with folks about whether outside investors can provide that kind of financial stability the farm operation needs and whether they can coexist with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have an entire chapter in my book, I titled Community Values, and it's
Hmm.
really meant for you as a family or as heirs to sort of pause and say, what is the legacy we want to leave with our family farm, whether we're choosing to diversify it, maybe sell part of it, keep part of it, and asking those bigger questions because ultimately, I mean, a landowner does have a lot of say in many cases, if they choose to sell the family farm on who the next steward of that farm becomes, and for some people, they don't have that luxury, but many families who take the time to do some succession planning well in advance, sort of have that luxury to be able to pick and choose maybe, who's going to take over the farm next. But, if you wait until you're in your 70s or your 80s to start having those conversations, sometimes it's too late, unfortunately. And then that's when somebody comes to us and they're in a cash crunch, or they're in a bad financial situation, and they don't have any choice. They have to sell the farm.
What's your experience with hard to put a percentage on this, but for the folks who have any succession plans already created, are we getting better as a society when it comes to that?
That's a great question. Um, let's see. Are we getting greater as a society? I'm not sure.
Okay.
Um, are certain families more cognizant of it today?
Hmm.
I think so, yeah. I think so. But are they having those tough conversations? That's where the crux is, because some people aren't good at sharing their feelings, and that's a natural human thing, right? Some people's personalities are aggressive and dominant, and some people are more submissive, and they may not be willing to share what's really going on. And so I do find, and I do believe this wholeheartedly, that if a family is in a situation where, there are differing visions or differing opinions, getting an outside perspective is ultimately helpful. You may still have to answer some tough questions for yourself or with the folks around your table, but I do think it's really important to get some outside perspective, because that can really help steer the direction and a strategy, whether, we're planning to farm this farm for another generation or two or five, or just reimagining what that legacy looks like.
I'm thinking in light of what some folks have to do, where it's essentially where we're going to need to grow. It's the only way we're going to survive based on maybe what we're growing. And then
Right.
you have the difference of opinion on whether physical growth, buying the neighbor's farm that is finally up for sale for the first time in 60 years is worth it, or
Yeah.
whether it's just concentrating on what you already have. That seems like that could be very difficult conversations too, right? When you're splitting a family.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, growth isn't always the right answer. Sometimes the right answer is just how can we farm what we have to the absolute best of our ability and focus on ROI. I mean, sometimes we get caught up in yield or whatever it happens to be, and it may not always be about that, right? Sometimes it's just, hey, we need to look at our financials here. This is about ROI, what's working, what's not working. And if you've got a great banker, or have ever even looked outside, to maybe a third party financial planner. I mean, I think people need to take advantage of those resources. You got to have the right people looking out for you.
I'm lucky in the sense that I'm talking to you after this book has already gone out. So you've already talked to groups about it. You've already done interviews. You've already had conversations. You've already been able to get some feedback. And I'm curious, when it comes to the feedback, what I appreciate that you're probably super proud of every single chapter in this book, but what is the topic that you're probably realizing that you've had the most feedback on? Is there something that sticks out?
I honestly think the feedback I've gotten the most starts really early in the book. I mean, I've always thought of the value of land as something far more than the price per acre, right? The whole concept behind the book is the idea of land values, and that every person has a different interpretation of what value means to them, right? For some people, that's emotional. For some people, that's sort of duty and principle, and for other people, it is financial, right? And it doesn't
Mhm.
take away from one or the other. And a lot of times, their values overlap all three of those categories. And I think that's where I've gotten the most feedback from, is that, when you sort of pause and you think, okay, what is most important to me right now? What was maybe important to my parents that they expressed to me about our family farm? What's important for the next generation? Sometimes especially when there's a lot of heirs involved, we find that a common theme is like, well, if we pass the farm to them, the problems might get worse, right? And so and that's a very real thing that does happen. I've seen it many, many times, but that seems to be where I've gotten the most feedback or the most comments, I guess, of, hey, this was really helpful to me because, my uncle sees it differently than I see it, and that's okay. But now I recognize that. I may not have seen it clearly before, but maybe now I'm seeing it a little more clear. So um, I've gotten a lot of feedback there. I did deliberately try to write the book to feel like we were sitting at the kitchen table together. To me, that's really important because that's where most of my conversations happen with my clients. We're either in the combine, we're on the tailgate of a pickup truck, or we're sitting at the kitchen table having a cup of coffee. And so I've gotten a lot of feedback from that standpoint too, that it doesn't feel like, it's saying you have to do it this way or you should do it this way. It's more conversational in nature.
So what if you're sitting at your kitchen table? How do you answer that question when you answer the value of the land?
Yeah, it's a big question, right? I mean, it strikes me in a lot of different ways because, I care about the soil. I care about my neighbor's farm too, and how our farms interact with one another. Our farm is a mixture of tillable ground, but mostly wooded in nature, So we've got riparian buffers, we've got wildlife, we forage, food, we grow food in our garden here. So value to me is more intrinsic, than it is financial at this point in time in life, but we've got our first grandbaby as well. So
Hmm.
those are things we're thinking about now. What's that look like in the future, I think really at the end of the day, as long as we can continue to instill in the next generation, uh, to follow your heart, to do what's best, to steward the land, to steward the farm, and ultimately know that if something does need to change in the future, it's okay if that does happen. I would much rather convey that than have somebody wondering, was this the right thing? Am I doing my ancestors, right or wrong by making this decision? I'd much rather communicate that sooner, to say, hey, it's okay to make these tough decisions, because I even think about our own family farm, would grandpa have want our family farm sold? Probably not, right? But ultimately, he farmed that land and that gift enabled all of our family members to move to the next chapter in their own life, which is also really important to, I think, recognize.
Well said. Thank you very much for the conversation and
Yeah, thank
congrats on
you.
the book.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. I really appreciate it. Thank you so very much.
He's Johnny Klemme, first-time author of American Family Farmland, a landowner's guide to inheriting the farm. You can learn more about Johnny's background if you check out our profile piece about him. It's in the weekly American Farmland Owner newsletter. It's totally free, and it's the place where landowners get their news. It's full of interviews, trends, and farmland values, and stories about overcoming challenges. You can check it out now at AmericanFarmlandOwner.com. Thanks for joining us here on the podcast, and thanks for caring about the future of our farmland.